Good morning, everyone. I'm Eli Pupko. I'm a doctoral student at the LBJ School here at UT Austin, and I'm very honored to be here today. As opposed to all the case studies that will be presented here today, my paper is an overview of constitutional design across Africa, as Professor Cooperman explained. And to my knowledge, this paper provides the first database classifying the political institutions of all African states from a conflict management perspective. I'm going to start by reviewing the theoretical background for the paper, after which I'll describe the methodology I used to create the Constitutional Design Index, and I'll then provide an overview of the results of the study and make a few concluding remarks. The debate in the literature about constitutional design for conflict management involves the question of which institutions work best for managing conflict and preventing wide-scale violence, particularly in deeply divided societies. The typology that I used to create an index of constitutional design is based on a theoretical distinction between integration and accommodation. Integration is defined as the attempt to create a unified national public identity, but allowing for the continued existence of differences in the private sphere. Accommodation, on the other hand, defines a pluralist national identity and provides ways for group distinctions to be expressed not only in the private sphere, but also in public institutions. Take, for example, the issue of how government positions are allocated in an ethnically diverse state. Accommodative approaches would advocate for affirmative action policies and perhaps ethnic quotas in order to make sure that public institutions reflect the makeup of the overall population. Integrative approaches, on the other hand, would insist on ethnically neutral policies on the ground that recognition of identity divisions in public institutions tends to reinforce those divisions, which then can undermine the sense of belonging to a national identity. More broadly, different political institutions are associated with integrative versus accommodative design. For the legislature, integrative approaches generally use majoritarian elections, which are by nature integrative as they produce only one winner. For the executive, integration is associated with a directly elected president who may be seen as a symbol of national unity. Accommodative approaches, on the other hand, believe that majoritarian elections are especially dangerous in deeply divided societies, as they often leave minority groups with no representation. The main feature of accommodation is thus to make sure that all politically relevant groups have a share in power, in order to motivate everyone to participate peacefully in the political system. Accommodative approaches therefore generally recommend proportional representation, or PR, systems for legislative elections, as under these systems, minority groups have better chances of winning seats. Accommodative approaches also generally reject a directly elected presidency on the ground that it creates a zero-sum game that works against principles of power sharing. They instead recommend a parliamentary executive with a head of government chosen by the legislative majority, as well as a power-sharing cabinet. In defining a national identity, integrative designs may support unifying public policies on language and education, and they often prohibit political parties from forming along identity group lines. Accommodative approaches, on the other hand, generally feature public policies that support a pluralist national identity, and they may encourage political identifications along these identity lines. Finally, integrative approaches are likely to support a unitary state, while accommodative approaches are more likely to support federalism and autonomy for identity groups. Now, it should be noted that there's really not much academic support for integrative institutions in deeply divided societies, but some scholars criticize the strong accommodative approach as tending to reinforce group divisions in a way that could end up encouraging extremism and potentially exacerbating conflict. These scholars instead recommend modifications to majoritarian systems that are meant to provide incentives for development of a politically moderate center. The modified majoritarian approach, for example, may recommend the alternative vote, also known as instant runoff voting, for legislative elections. This system is intended to encourage the formation of coalitions prior to elections between different groups. For the executive, a directly elected president may be allowed, but the electoral system is modified to require a broader base of support. On national identity issues, these designs emphasize flexibility in identity divisions and they focus on how to encourage the expression of commonalities between groups. For the state structure, they may recommend federalism or decentralization, but in a way that cuts across and does not reinforce identity divisions. In general, the modified majoritarian approach looks for a balance between integration and accommodation, admitting the existence of identity divisions, but looking for institutions that encourage transcending them. I'll now turn to the methodology that I used to create the index. Countries are coded on 3 dimensions. The first dimension looks at the executive, including whether there's a directly elected president or a parliamentary system. The legislative dimension looks primarily at the electoral system for the legislature, whether majoritarian, proportional, or mixed. The third dimension is termed administrative. It measures whether the state structure is unitary or federal, and whether there have been grants of autonomy to minority groups. General principles affecting national identity are also classified under this dimension, including things like language policies and regulation of political parties. The coding proceeds as follows. Countries are rated on a 5-point scale, ranging from -2 for hyper-integrative design to +2 for hyper-accommodation. The 0 category represents a theoretically balanced approach of modified majoritarian design. The data is collected cross-sectionally with countries evaluated as of January 1st, 2011, although historical trends may also be considered. The coding is based on the following general rules. If all 3 dimensions are integrative or accommodative, the coding is -2 or +2 respectively. If only 2 of the 3 dimensions point in the same direction, the coding is -1 or +1. As indicated, the 0 category is reserved for distinctive designs of modified majoritarian systems. Now, ultimately, the practical functioning of political institutions is considered to be more relevant than legal provisions of constitutional design. However, the method of analysis generally begins with evaluation of de jure textual provisions, then proceeds to make modifications for de facto functioning. In all cases where de facto and de jure designs are significantly different, a separate de jure coding is provided as well. An example of how a particular case was coded should help to clarify the methodology. So here's a brief illustration of how I coded Mozambique. The Constitution of Mozambique provides for a directly elected president in a 2-round majority system, so the executive dimension is considered integrative. On the legislative dimension, the National Assembly is elected through a PR system, which is generally considered accommodative. On the administrative dimension, the state has a unitary structure with only minimal decentralization to local levels. Also, national unity is listed as an aspiration in the Constitution, and political parties are regulated to that effect, so the administrative dimension is clearly integrative. Now, since 2 of the 3 dimensions are integrative with only 1 accommodative, the initial de jure coding of Mozambique is moderately integrative or -1. However, in the de facto analysis, the PR system for the legislature is found to exclude several small parties from gaining seats. So in actuality, it may fail to have accommodative effects. Perhaps more importantly, one party has dominated the legislature since 2009, since a 1992 peace agreement. And in 2009, that party also gained a two-thirds majority in the legislature, sufficient to amend the Constitution. These factors imply integration on the legislative dimension in spite of the PR electoral system. In the de facto analysis, therefore, Mozambique has been coded as -2, or highly integrative. Now, a similar analysis was done for all 53 countries in Africa, which yields a distribution looking like this. These are the de jure design codings for each country, which are provided in an appendix, and a separate table is also provided listing the de facto codings. Moving on now to the results. If we look broadly at the distribution of constitutional design across Africa, the main finding is a significant bias toward integration. About 75% of the countries are coded as either -1 or -2 in the de jure design codings, while the de facto codings fall about 80% on the integrative side. Additionally, most of the countries for which differences are observed between de facto and de jure design, 18 out of 53 total, consist of cases where the political order in practice is not as accommodative as it would appear to be on paper. There are a few exceptions to this rule, but the overwhelming tendency leans toward integration. Well, the primary motivator of this bias is the widespread institution of a directly elected presidency. Excluding monarchies, only 7 African countries currently lack directly elected presidents. Moreover, in practice, most presidents exercise power over all executive functions through cabinet appointments and other means of direct control, and they also often influence the composition of the legislature as well. Now, although not quite as drastic as the executive dimension, African legislatures also lean toward integration, with majoritarian systems the most common for elections. There are a significant number of legislatures elected under proportional systems, 16 total, but in most of these cases the legislature is weak or effectively powerless even in relation to the executive. The mixed systems generally have most seats elected under majoritarian rules, with only 3 having at least 2/3 elected by PR. Finally, there are only 7 countries with federal structures, though an additional 5 do grant varying degrees of governmental autonomy. A unitary state is by far the most common governing structure. Furthermore, a majority of African constitutions endorse principles of integration by declaring explicit goals for a unified national identity and by placing restrictions on identity-based politics. Now, based on these overall results, one might conclude that there's little creativity in African constitutions, with only minimal exploration of the range of design alternatives. I mentioned before that there's virtually no academic support for integrative design in deeply divided societies. Now, it's true that not all African states can be classified as deeply divided, but it is clear that many states that are, in fact, deeply divided nevertheless have highly integrative designs. There are a few cases where the recommendations of scholars may have had some effect, such as in the overall accommodative systems in South Africa and Burundi, or the modified majoritarian designs used for presidential elections in Nigeria and Kenya. But scholars themselves note that the process of constitutional choice is subject to all kinds of political influence, and decisions are generally not undertaken with anything like academic analysis. Still, there are opportunities for at least marginal influence by outsiders, including not just academics, obviously, but perhaps more so practitioners, including diplomats and NGO officials, who help to write or amend constitutions across Africa. The results of this research might hopefully inform these efforts with data on current practices. This database could also provide a basis for future research, testing different theories of the effects of constitutional design on conflict outcomes. In order to do that, first, the cross-sectional survey could be expanded to a panel data set documenting changes in integration or accommodation over time in each case. Second, since most theories assume a basic level of democratic functioning and are generally targeted to deeply divided societies, we would want to control for these variables. In order to facilitate this analysis, the current database already includes democracy codings from Polity 4 for each country where available. Now, a variable for assessing identity divisions would also be needed to test how these social structures mediate the effects of constitutional design. But there remains a need for better quantitative measurement of the depth of social divisions across Africa. In conclusion, whether there are connections between the data presented here and conflict management outcomes in specific cases or across the continent is beyond the scope of this paper, but the data presented do make a start in the direction of answering these questions. In any event, although constitutional design is almost universally accepted as an important factor for conflict management, the lack of consensus on ideal institutions and the problems of implementation should ensure that these debates continue for some time. Thank you very much, and I look forward to discussion.
So, thank you very much, Ellie. First piece of advice, if you ever run a project, get a great graduate research assistant. Do we have Igosa on the line?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. Igosa, let me just briefly introduce you. Igosa Osagai is Professor of Comparative Politics and Vice Chancellor of the I always mess this one up, Igbinedion University.
Igbinedion.
Thank you very much, Igosa. In Okada, Nigeria. Amongst his many accomplishments, he chaired the Pan-African Working Group on Building Institutional Effectiveness in Africa. So you can imagine how lucky we felt to get him on board this project. I will just mention two of his books, which also show his expertise in this area. One is called Between State and Civil Society in Africa, and another is called Researching Conflict in Africa, Insights and Experiences. The full bio for all of our participants is available on the CDCM website. So without any further ado, I turn to Nigeria and Igosa Osagai.
Thank you very much. I hope I'm clear.
Good.
Good. So the title of my presentation is Nigeria's Niger Delta, Environmental Insecurity, Minorities and the State. There's some echo. Can you hear me well?
No, I think we're getting an echo. Can you turn off your speaker so you just are speaking into the microphone, but you're not hearing us for a while? That's from Philippe's. Philippe, can we turn you off for a second?
Is it better now?
Yes, better, I think.
It's better?
Much better.
Okay. So, can you hear me?
Perfect.
Which one is perfect? This one? This one is perfect. One is wrong?
We can hear you.
Okay, you can hear me. Now, so basically, this study is about a Nigerian Niger Delta region, which is the location of Nigeria's crude oil. The region is basically one of the areas of ethnic minority concentration in the country. That provides a constitutional challenge in itself. But in addition, it is also the milk cow of the country, which, as you probably know, is an oil-rich economy. All of Nigeria's oil is produced from the Niger Delta and the Gulf of Guinea, which is next to that region. Now, since oil was discovered in 1956 and put to commercial use that same year, that region has been host to very violent conflicts that have at one and the same time dimensions of environmental justice, environmental degradation, and all of these things that are associated with the adverse effects of climate change in the world. A 2011 study by the United Nations environmental body, UNEP, reported long years of pollution and spillage, leading to very hazardous levels of contamination of air, soil, and water. In fact, in one instance in Ogoniland, which was made famous by Ken Saro-Wiwa, a minority rights activist, it was reported that the water in the well had over 900 times the safe benzene level in water recommended by the World Health Organization. And even more alarming, it was reported that the pollution in the place and the sites of spillage would take nearly 30 years to clean up, even with all the best of intentions and resources. Now, so indeed, this is a major challenge to constitutional stability all round through the intermediation, of course, of climate change. What we did using the framework that was agreed for this project was to look at three shocks in historical sequence in the country and to see how these shocks produced, challenges that were constitutional at one and the same time and threatened the country's political stability all round. The first shock was the one that covered the period of the 1960s and the 1980s. Here, the key thing was the oil windfall. This was a country that was, at that point, just becoming an oil economy. And many would recall that, with the first shock of the early 1970s, following OPEC and so on, we had Nigeria transform from some poor country to some mega rich oil country. Now, that period, of course, covered the civil war. There was a 30-month civil war in the country, which some have adduced, or explained in terms of the rise of oil as the major revenue earner in the country. But the immediate consequence of that shock, was the attempt by the federal government, which was controlled by the military at the time, to immediately introduce acts of fiscal centralization. Perhaps I should have started as a footnote that Nigeria is a federal country, and for a long time, it had the basic tenets of some kind of balanced federal system that had, fiscal autonomy, relative fiscal autonomy for the constituent units of the country. So when fiscal centralization came, of course, the major victims were the states, the constituent units of the country, as the central government immediately took steps to take complete control, absolute control of the oil economy. The first thing it did was to enact a new decree that gave the federal government control of all mineral resources on land, under land, and in the seas. Well, of course, this triggered, conflict over resource sharing. Incidentally, because here we were at the time in the country, as I said earlier, all the oil was derived from the Niger Delta, and Nigeria had just come out of, serious struggles that involved, as the history says, attempts by the major ethnic groups to more or less dominate the country's politics. The minority elements would claim that they were marginalized. Now, but here was an opportunity, finally, for them with the discovery of oil. And yet, this was the time when the federal government decided to take over absolute control of all that came from oil. Now, so the kinds of conflicts that we had were very major conflicts, but they did not lead to violence. And here I think that there are two factors that must be considered. One was that the country had fought a civil war, and therefore it looked like that was a no-go area. The whole notion of violent conflicts was something that was too recent in the memory of everyone in the country to be contemplated for any reason. Second, and perhaps more importantly, was that the circumstances of the civil war made it possible for the military government to undertake what was then regarded as a corrective policy. It was a constitutional measure, that seemed to respond finally to the claims, the grievances of the minorities, that had bedeviled the country's federal system since colonial times. The agitation for separate states. And therefore, you had a situation where, with the creation of states, especially involving the creation also of a river state and a cross-river state for Niger Delta minorities, you had helped to resolve one problem. So the minorities now had, at least a pedestal for insisting on a first-line accommodation, political accommodation in the country, and also to share from the country's resources using the instruments of fiscal federalism, albeit a very highly centralized one. So, in a sense, we can say that the constitutional instrumentalities were capable, of of managing these, the festering violent conflicts that followed this first shock, precisely because here we were with a federal system that was made even stronger with the creation of states to replace the regions. The second shock covers the period between the 1990s up until 2003. Now, this is the one that I think gave the Niger Delta region a lot of global attention. The shock revolved around the rapid expansion of oil operations and production, which extended the volume of gas flaring, pollution, and spillages, and other environmental hazards, as well as demands for compensation and derivation. I think derivation is something that I should spend 1 minute to explain. Derivation is one of the principles for resource sharing in Nigeria that says you give to a constituent unit revenue that is proportional to its contribution to the federation's resources. Now, for a long time, the regions, before the states were created, enjoyed 50% of whatever was derived from the region and contributed the remainder 50%, to the federation account, which was the common pool. But you remember a while ago I talked about fiscal centralization. The first thing the military did was to reduce the quota, devoted to derivation, the principle of derivation. And therefore, you had very serious claims, from the ethnic minorities, claims of injustice and oppression and so on, under military rule. Now, the military government at the time, of course, had very violent means of repressing, grievance articulation of any kind. And therefore, we had very violent conflicts at this time. The military, was less amenable to addressing the issues that were raised systematically or peacefully, if you like. So that sharpened the perceptions of injustice, relative deprivation, and neglect, and heightened agitations for redress, especially as these agitations found resonance in the emergence of issues of environmental protection and justice, minority rights, and democratization on top of the global development agenda. In other words, this was an intervening variable. One of those things that, Alan had referred to, the background factors, that were not exactly constitutional, but were no less important. The global environment, in effect, emboldened the Niger Delta protest movements. Once again, it was the failure of the governments and the oil companies, which were now a major object of attack, to respond appropriately to legitimate demands for redress that triggered the environmental and resource conflicts. But of course, we had at this time in the 1990s, especially leading up until the end of that decade, a regime of austerity, which also helped to strengthen the demands, or if you like, the challenges of survival. And so minority group after minority group in Niger Delta took on names like the movement for the survival of those groups. So this was the whole thing. Now, what happened was, by 1999, yes, please.
We have only 2 more minutes, so if you could wrap up your presentation in 2 minutes, we would appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you. The third shock, covered the period between 2003 and 2010. This was another period of the price hikes, and the quarrels over excess crude accounts. Now, this has been a major issue of contention. What to do each time there's been a windfall in Nigeria. These things are called windfalls, when we have the upward swings in the global crude oil market. And, the constitutional deficits that I've talked about, the skewed fiscal arrangement, and the overbearing power of the federal government, contributed to producing the very violent outcomes that we've had. Now, I think that on on balance, you know, Nigeria's federal system has been very helpful. The emphasis has been on how to accommodate difference and provide guarantees for the ethnic minority groups. Now, perhaps, you know, in the absence of, say, a military government, if there was democratic government, all of this would have found, you know, good effect, you know, in addressing many of the issues that the shocks triggered off. But of course, since 1999, when the country returned to democratic rule and constitutional order, there has been a strengthening of those instrumentalities. And let me just finally, to close, summarize what these things have been. There is a very flexible revenue sharing structure that allows the federal government and the constituency to negotiate, you know, what resources should go to what levels of government. There is the whole question of how to share power, you know, amongst now the federal government, the state governments, and the local governments, because Nigeria is one of the few federal systems where local governments are provided for in the constitution with scheduled powers and other allocations. Now, the third thing, of course, is the instrument of state creation that has helped to ameliorate minority problems in the federation. The fourth is the principle of federal character, which is, you know, Nigeria's own variant of constitutional democracy that has been used in the allocation of political offices and positions, and even the composition of federal bodies and state bodies all over the country. Now, all of these things, given the long history, the very long history of military authoritarian rule, are just beginning to find effect. But it does appear that the greatest problem the Constitution has faced in terms of responding to the shocks and therefore the overall problems of the Niger Delta is that the Niger Delta issue has been treated first as a security issue, narrowly as a security issue, and second as only a resource issue. So the result has been that, you know, most of the things that have been attempted by government, whether by way of developmental intervention or by way of setting up, you know, things, have been seen as palliative measures that do not exactly get to the fundamentals of the constitutional structures of the country. You know, but as I say, these are things that are going on, and democracy has provided an opportunity for negotiations and bargains, and that is going on at the present time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so our next presenter is Philippe Renchens, who is Professor of African Law and Politics at the Institute of Development Policy and Management at the University of Antwerp. And I should also say and thank him again for hosting the workshop that we held earlier this year at his institute. Philippe Renchens is among the most well-respected, if not the foremost, academic expert on the Great Lakes region of Africa. This is the area with Rwanda, Burundi, Congo, Uganda. And in addition to his academic work, which involves a dozen books and hundreds of scholarly articles, he has gotten involved in the policy related area in terms of, amongst other things, serving as an expert witness in courts in Rwanda, Burundi, Congo, as well as at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda and the International Criminal Court. He's made some friends, and he's also made some enemies by speaking truth to power. And on a personal note, I would just like to say that he's been an extraordinarily generous scholar to me, including when I was a very young graduate student. So without any further ado, I turn to you, Philippe.
Thank you very much, Alan. It's such a pity I can't be with all of you in Austin. It's pretty frustrating, particularly when I look at the list of people present there. Many people I know well and I respect. So it's a pity, but that's the situation. Quickly, few things. My institute yesterday and today has the visit of an audit, a research audit panel. You know, one of those things that we suffer from, all of us. You know, assessments and that sort of thing. And I've got to be here because I chair our research commission. Actually, I sent a PowerPoint presentation. Could you show it, or don't we need it?
Yes, we'll be showing it momentarily.
Okay.
You can continue.
Okay. Anyway, it's not essential. I mean, we can live without the PowerPoint presentation. Let me start by saying, well, the title of the presentation and probably the title of the article in the forthcoming book is Burundi, Institutionalizing Ethnicity to Bridge the Divide. And so let me start with the, can we have the next slide?
Yep.
Okay. Let me start, of course, by identifying the shock in terms of the CDCM project. I initially thought that the shock was ethnic strife. And with the help of people, and particularly of Alan, I realized that it's not ethnic strife, but something in the context of potential ethnic strife. So you find the definition, there's a lot of background noise. Is that...
We're just having audio issues. Just plow through, Philippe.
Yeah, because I think there's a lot of noise with Igosa, actually. Yeah. So it's... If you look at the slide, I would include three elements. It's one definition, the three elements of the shock that has been attempted, or that the Burundians have attempted to address on its democratic elections. That's the first element. The second is in a bipolar ethnic setup. Just for those who are unfamiliar with Burundi, Hutu number about 85% of the population and Tutsi about 15%. And the third element, which I think is relevant too, is a history of ethnic minority domination. Now, these three elements together, in my view, constitute the shock in terms of the CDC. There is a note on this first slide. It goes without saying, but I think it's always useful to remind that, of course, we should not see ethnic groups as being in power or not in power. It is, of course, always elites of ethnic groups that are in power or not in power. So, I mean, you can have a minority of a minority that's in power, or if the majority ethnic group is in power, the minority of the majority would be in power. Can I have the next slide?
Okay.
Yep. You find a brief historical background. I'm not going to elaborate. I would simply point at the last bullet, policy of ethnic amnesia, because that's going to change, and that's going to be part of the CDCM adventure, so to speak, of Burundi. The policy of ethnic amnesia means, and this was used as an expression until the late 1980s, there are no Hutu or Tutsi in Burundi. The only thing you have is Burundians, and that is essential, of course. A policy or a discourse, a narrative of ethnic amnesia is essential to maintain even ethnic minority controls power, because if you accept ethnicity, then of course it becomes almost officially clear that the minority of a minority, in this case, is exercising power. I should say that this is, of course, extremely important in the sense that since it goes, come on. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed since 1965 as a result of ethnic strife, or at least as a result of the manipulation of ethnic strife. I'm watching my watch, Alan, don't worry.
Okay.
Next slide, please. This changed. Yeah, you can have all the bullets there in. Yeah, okay. Let's all have them. All right. This was to change at the end of 1988, when there was a new round of ethnic violence in August of 1988. A great deal of international pressure, and the Burundian regime, I think mainly as a result of that pressure, introduced a number of things that we would certainly, with the benefit of hindsight, consider as consociational elements. For instance, the introduction, without saying so, of parity in the government, but also, for instance, in a national commission to study the issue of national unity. And you will find the same thing in the 1992 constitution, again without quota, for instance, without formal quota, but these were first steps look at the provision saying, I think at 12 occasions, in 12 articles of that constitution, taking into account the diverse components part of the Burundian population, for instance, for the leadership of political parties, the elaboration of electoral lists, the composition of government, and things like that. Again, without mentioning Hutu or Tutsi, but clearly referring to Hutu or Tutsi and to a lesser extent the regional issue. And an important thing that was introduced in 1992 as well, I'll return to that in a moment because it proved to be extremely successful in terms of constitutional engineering, was a closed list voting system, meaning, anticipating to what's going to come, meaning that voters could not modify the order on the lists, for instance, and particularly for parliamentary elections, i.e. Hutu, for instance, could not, as they are the majority, could not just vote for Hutu and have all those Hutu being elected. Voters voted for a list in the order that was on the list. And if, of course, you take into account the diverse component parts of the Burundian population on a closed list voting system, obviously both Hutu and Tutsi, both majority, demographic majority and minority, would be represented. Next slide. 1993 elections were conducted in June and July of 1993, and in the context of the constitution, I've just very briefly summarized an opposition party that was seen as essentially a Hutu party, Frodebu, won the election. After so many years, as I've told you, so many years of rule by the minority, or at least the elite of the minority Tutsi. There were many attempts made by the new government that took office in early July 1993 to accommodate Tutsi fears, because one of the things they feared, of course, was the loss of privileges they had enjoyed during the last 25 years or 30 years, but also physical fears, the fear that they would be in now for victimization and that the Hutu were going to take their revenge. And the consequence of those fears was a coup d'etat organized by the very predominantly Tutsi army in October of 1993. President Dadaye, who was elected in early July, was assassinated together with a number of other people. And this was the start of a civil war that lasted for 10 years. Next slide. In 1994, and certainly the years following, 1996, 1997, and this eventually led to an accord, a political accord signed in Arusha in August of 2000, negotiations were organized under very strong, and this is something I think I will insist on again, under very strong international and particularly regional oversight. And what you have here on that slide is, well, I would say the first bullet is the CDCM bullet. I mean, it's the constitutional engineering that allowed successfully, as I will show in a minute. I've got 6 minutes, I think, Alan.
Well done.
And you find a number of, typically, although Burundi, and this has been studied by others than me, Burundi is not the ideal country for a constitutional dispensation a la Leiphart. But if you look at these few points under constitutional constitution, surely this looks very much like constitutionalism. I mean, there would be one, and there is one Tutsi and one Hutu vice president. The assumption was obviously that the president would be Hutu, which eventually materialized. The cabinet was 60%, or is still today 60% Hutu, 40% Tutsi. National Assembly 60-40, Senate 50-50. Again, the closed list voting system to avoid Hutu voting for Hutu and returning a completely Hutu parliament, and a very strongly entrenched constitution. Look at this, 80%, 4/5 of the vote needed for constitutional revision. There's one point I actually forgot to put on the slide, and it's a very important one as well, given the history of Burundi. The armed forces and the police were to be 50-50 also, Hutu and Tutsi. So really a very strong accommodative system. There are a number of other elements. I can't go into any detail, but as you see under in the next bullets, There are a number of other elements. I mean, constitutional design was not the only way that led to successful pacification, so to speak, of Burundi, or at least successful management of the ethnic issue. There are a number of other points as well. I'll just take you through them with elaborating. The political landscape became much more multipolar and not bipolar. Because there would be, for instance, more than one Hutu party and more than one Tutsi party, which meant the system became much more multipolar. The elites in all walks of life, civil society, political parties, the army, the press, probably as a result, certainly to some extent, of this experience of a 10-year civil war, became much more moderate. There was a de facto, I've already referred to that, a de facto trusteeship. It was never called like that. It was a trusteeship by the region. And finally, and important in the Burundian context again, because the army had been derailing political processes so many times over the last 25 years, a very robust, very credible South African-led peacekeeping force. So it's a combination of all those elements. Can I have the next slide? Combination of all those elements that led to pacification. Let me take you through, but very rapidly, to the result of the 2005 elections under this new constitutional dispensation, but also in the context of that changed environment, including this very strong South African military presence. This is, of course, very interesting that through constitutional engineering, you would find that the party that won the election, although it had by no means an overall majority, but CNDD-FDD had almost half of its MPs were Tutsi. And of course the number, and this was considered a Hutu party, by the way, while the party that is considered, and that is actually a mainly Tutsi party, UPRONA, only had 15 Tutsi MPs. Of course, they only had 15 seats in parliament. But it's quite interesting to see that in the CNDD-FDD, almost 1/3 of MPs were Tutsi, and this is really a consequence of constitutional engineering, simply because the constitution and the electoral law provided that there should be alternative, one Hutu, one Tutsi, one Hutu, one Tutsi, etc. on the lists. Add to that the blocked voting system, and obviously this the main political party or the winner of the elections would have, through constitutional reasons, a sizable number of Tutsi. Next slide. And I'm not going to take you through that slide because my time is nearly up. What you see is that Burundi, in a sense, I wouldn't say despite successful constitutional engineering, but paradoxically, as a result of successful constitutional engineering, has become a pretty banal African case of winner takes all in political terms, not in ethnic terms. So what we've seen in Burundi is a development we've seen in many other African countries. But what made Burundi and its neighbor Rwanda, of course, so special was this history of extremely violent ethnic strife in bipolar ethnic setups. This has disappeared in Burundi. I mean, there is not today any ethnic violence. There is, I'll return to that in the conclusion, there is some political violence. The last election in 2010, under the same constitutional dispensation, led, because of many opposition, a number of opposition parties boycotted the election, hoping that they could force through a Kenyan or Zimbabwean scenario of power sharing. They miscalculated, and CNDD-FDD now has 76% of seats in the National Assembly, very close, as you will see, to the 80% constitutional amendment threshold. But actually, one of the other parties in parliament is really a satellite of the CNDD-FDD. So they are actually together are beyond that threshold. For reasons I explained in the paper, I don't think, however, that the pacifying elements, particularly in ethnic terms, will be amended out of the constitution, so to speak. Let me conclude because I've got 30 seconds left. In terms of the ethnic divide, as I said, constitutional engineering has proved I think, extremely effective. And violence now, because there is some violence and then some even a resuming rebellion, although I don't think it is very credible, but it is there, is now between parties. In other words, violence is now political, and the violence is not between ethnic groups. And a final point I wanted to make is that if you compare Burundi with Rwanda, and this is something one can do because the ethnic setup in Rwanda is very comparable to that in Burundi, but in Rwanda, of course, ethnic amnesia, as I called it earlier, is practiced because the elite of a minority ethnic group, the Tutsi, are in power, ethnicity is outlawed, but all field research that has been conducted over the last 10 years show very well that ethnicity remains very pervasive, and that is actually exacerbated by an artificially imposed policy of national unity. And in that sense, the prospects, although I know Rwanda is a donor darling and is seen as extremely successful, at least economically speaking, which is true, the prospects for Rwanda, I'm afraid, are bleaker than those for Burundi. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Philippe, for a succinct and clear presentation and for serving as your own timekeeper. We have two discussants today, as we will on each panel, and what I've tried to do is put together discussants who have some overlapping expertise, but whose major focus of their own work is slightly different from each other. And in that way, we hope to get at least two perspectives to help start the discussion. So first, I'd like to introduce Zachary Elkins. University of Texas at Austin is very lucky to have on our campus in the government department one of the, and again, I can say one of, or perhaps the foremost expert on comparative analysis of constitutions. Zach Elkins has co-authored a book from Cambridge University Press called The Endurance of National Constitutions, and he's currently completing another book manuscript entitled, or I guess at least for now entitled, Designed by Diffusion, Constitutional Reform in Developing Democracies. In addition to that, he co-directs the Comparative Constitutions Project, which is funded by the National Science Foundation. And in addition to that, he co-directs a website, www.constitutionmaking.org, which provides resources and analysis for constitutional drafters in emerging democracies. And so without any further ado, I turn it over to Zach Elkins.
Thank you, Alan. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm pleased to take part in at least one of the series of events that's part of this project. As Alan mentioned, my expertise is really in constitutional design and not so much in the cases of Africa, but it's really hard not to get excited about Africa, in part because there's so much going on in terms of the frequency of constitutional reform, but also, of course, the magnitude of the scope of some of the challenges that some of these institutions are meant to address. These are three very rich papers, and what I'd like to do is to identify some global concerns that I think has something to do with each of the three papers, but then if I could point out a few things from each and put some things on the table for discussion. I think it's exciting that climate change is part of the equation, and it's a very aggressive, generous, heroic, I think, goal to include that as part of that. And I think one thing that's interesting about that is that it puts on the table a whole bunch of shocks, many of which are very remote to many of these challenges. And when I told my wife, who's an environmentalist, that I'm now working on climate change, she was not happy. She's very territorial. But I think one thing that, despite the fact that climate change is at least remotely very much a part of the problems that these constitutions address, it's not front and center in any of the papers. In fact, the papers, for the most part, at least the sort of the meta theme of the papers has to do mostly with dealing with ethnic diversity, which I think is the instinct for most of us when we think about constitutions in very diverse places, such as these 3 cases, or these 2 cases plus the Pan-African caseload that Ellie deals with. And, you know, I think Professor Osagai's paper in some ways goes well beyond diversity, which is very strange in some ways, since when we think of Nigeria, we often, especially non-experts like myself, think of that as the quintessential challenge for those dealing with ethnic diversity. But of course, in that case, it's dealing with economic shocks. Let me just talk about a few broad issues and then get into the papers. I think one of them has to do with the set of cases here, since a lot of the theory that we're dealing with is meant to apply really not just to developing democracies, but to Western Europe, for which obviously there's all sorts of constitutional challenges in dealing with ethnic diversity and other things. And so one question, of course, is what's special about this set of cases? And can we take this theory and apply them to these cases? And if so, why not? Or why can we? And in some ways, you want to, or at least I would want to think about whether issues of inequality, resource concentration, and overall level of development are really, I guess, in some ways affecting and interacting with the constitutional solutions we choose, but in other ways almost overwhelming these choices. And I guess one question behind that is whether constitutional choices matter at all in this context, or whether they're just swallowed up by much bigger forces. And that gets to, of course, the environmental shocks. And in that sense, I guess to be more specific about it, I'm wondering whether the constitutional solutions and prescriptions are independent additive effects that might ameliorate whatever problem we're trying to solve, or whether they're sort of working in an interactive sense and helping us weather the storm. Another meta issue in these set of papers has to do with, you know, the use of constitutions, because in some ways, I think in the end, what each of the 3 authors is dealing with is coming up with one solution, whether it's entrenched in higher law in something called the Constitution or basic law, or whether it's part of ordinary law or part of some administrative policy of some sort, or for that matter, part of, as in Ellie's case, even norms and practices. And so I think it's nice to focus on constitutional design, because there's a moment in which most people in the country are actually focused on these issues in a very concerted, deliberate way. But of course, it seems like in many ways the ordinary law, and not just ordinary law of the country, but international law, seems to matter just as much, and I think that's worth taking into account. The other thing, and this gets back to I think what I was mentioning before, is sort of the instinctive concern for most of us when we think about these countries, is to think about bringing some harmony and some peace, especially among contending ethnic groups. But of course, in constitutional design, there are multiple, sometimes competing objectives. And I think in each of the papers, it would be interesting to actually, maybe essential to identify those objectives. When you're writing a constitution, obviously, you're trying to put together a bargain that, at least as I think about it, a contract that allows the contending groups to actually work together through theoretically some sort of democratic governance. You want also a document that serves as a national symbol, especially in very new countries that don't have many historic signals to sort of, if you want, bring people together in some sense of national attachment. So they serve that purpose. There's a lot of social justice issues to address. Many, especially in Washington, are very concerned about the efficiency of government and state capacity and things like that. So obviously, in terms of a constitution, you worry about that set of issues. And in addition to state harmony and what I think of as stateness, it's a concept that political scientists such as Juan Linz and Robert Dahl have sort of popularized, but I think of it as just sort of national harmony or national unity. In addition to that, you know, we care also about accountability and representation, and I think it's very much the case that these solutions cut against, and this is probably clear to everybody in this room, cut against accountability, and so I think it's worth taking that into consideration. Alan, I'm not as good, I must confess,
7 minutes left.
as Philippe about
7 minutes
monitoring
left. You're
myself.
about halfway through.
Thank you. Let me start with Ellie's paper. This in many ways is a paper, right, in my own vein of research, and this is my instinct in some ways, is to look across a bunch of countries and really in a very broad perspective, get a sense of the institutional landscape. I think what's really important is to focus a little bit more on the temporal dimension, because I'm assuming, and this was unstated, I think, Ellie, that these are contemporary constitutional situations, and of course, one thing is that we know that that will change over the next 5 years. But the other thing is that in many ways what matters is when these institutions or constitutions were adopted, and to the extent that maturation of these laws means anything, and I think that it does. I think with constitutions, they're very aspirational in general, but certainly they take, in my analysis, at least 10 to 15, sometimes a generation for the de jure law to have any relation whatsoever to the de facto law. So I think it makes sense to build in that temporal dimension. In terms of your typology, I think one thing that's great about your paper is how well it brought together and synthesized a lot of theory out there on constitutional design for diverse states. I would quibble a little bit with the dimension, which in some ways is almost all-consuming, ranging from integrationist to accommodationist. I certainly see theoretically how that works. On the other hand, it seems like when you're talking about policies on the integrationist side, you're talking about some very majoritarian policies. Let's say sort of the direct election of the head of state. In some ways, that's integrationist in the sense that everybody is voting together for one single person who will lead them all. On the other hand, it is very majoritarian. And when I think of integrationist policies, I think of others that really emphasize the common in-group identity among citizens in that country. So things like, and I think this is the quintessential integrationist policy, a very inclusive citizenship law that allows, at least for immigrant minorities, and of course in Africa, those sorts of minorities matter more and more these days, but for those very, very clearly admits all members as a member of the country. And to me, that's very much an integrationist policy. Another integrationist policy, and this is inadvertent, of course, is to build a common enemy. And in many constitutional settings in which the international actors are involved, maybe even militarily, that is very integrationist. And I think Iraq is actually a perfect example of this, and since this is a DoD-sponsored event, it makes sense to mention it. The U.S. has served very well as that common enemy, and I think, and I looked at the data recently, that interethnic violence at least has gone down a little bit in Iraq. Not that we should treat the case as a success. Anyway, there's more to say on Ellie's, but let me move on to Professor Osagai's really rich and detailed description. I think that if anybody wants a very multifaceted, multidimensional sense of the problems in both the Niger Delta and Nigeria, this is a paper to be recommended. In some ways, it's very frustrating. After page 20, you get a sense that, and this is what I alluded to in the introduction, that the many problems facing the country really are ones that are, I think, immune perhaps to constitutional design, and some of the shocks and some of the economic grievances and the cycle of violence that's taking place in the Niger Delta maybe beyond constitutional issues. But I think, to put a few things on the table, one thing that seems to me incredibly important for a region such as that is the development of some sort of legal system, because it seems to me in the narrative that Professor Osagai presented that grievances about environmental degradation and multinational companies and the sort, really what you need, I think, is a set of administrative agencies to help regulate that better in a legal system to actually at least adjudicate disputes along those lines. I'm very, in an analytical sense, it's a very rich descriptive study, but I'm wondering what, if you were to think counterfactually about Nigeria and what it would look like without some of these institutions, I really don't have a clear sense. I think that's one way to sort of push analytically the paper forward, is to at least get into that mindset. Another thing that's really interesting about the analysis, which I think would be worth bringing out, maybe even privileging as the sort of the central theme of the paper, is this issue of authoritarian constitutions. Because one thing that's mentioned, I mean, I think most of us have the instinct that an authoritarian constitution is one that works better with respect to ethnic harmony because of oppression or because of its a common enemy or for whatever reason. But Professor Osagai makes the point that actually the authoritarians have been the most creative in any of these constitutions, and I think that is actually worth bringing out. I have a lot more to say on that and other things with respect to that really rich paper, but let me look at Philippe Renkin's paper and really not do it justice in the 2 minutes that I have, and I apologize, Philippe, but I'll of course interject later if there's an opportunity. I think one thing that to keep in mind that I'm interested in is Philippe, for you to bring out maybe this issue of Rwanda, because obviously the development of some of these problems in Burundi and the conflict in Burundi is coming at almost simultaneously, I think, with the Rwandan problems. And in that context, I mean, analytically, it makes sense, I think, to do some comparisons with respect to maybe post-conflict solutions that were or were not tried. In the Burundi case, it seems like they were not tried. But also the element of diffusion. I mean, it seems like the two cases are so parallel with respect to demographics and with respect to perhaps not the scope of violence, but the nature of the violence, that I think some sort of comparison makes sense. Let me stop there and interject later since I'm out of time.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Our final panelist on this panel is Pierre Engelbert. Pierre is a professor of African politics at Pomona College in Claremont, California. And amongst his many accomplishments, I will highlight 2 books. One is called Africa, Unity, Sovereignty, and Sorrow. That's by Lynn Reiner in 2009. And the second is State Legitimacy and Development in Africa by the same publishing house in 2000. So without any further ado, Pierre.
Thank you. Thank you, Alan, for inviting me, and thank you all for coming. And it's good to see you, Egosa and Philippe, however little I'm actually seeing you. I'm glad to be part of this. Those were 3 very rich papers, and I'm going to go right away into each one of them and try to do them some justice. Starting with Eli, it's a very interesting exercise to actually try to rank order, score countries' performance in terms of integration, accommodation in Africa. He does so looking at executive, legislative, and administrative dimension, and by through the executive and legislative, it's really the electoral system that gets the prime emphasis, and in administration, it looks at issues of decentralization, etc. I want to right away go to the findings. So that table 1, right, that he showed us, and that if you flip it around, it looks like a histogram, right, but backwards, right? So, but you have the columns which give you the frequency of outcomes, right? And if you look at that, the 2 first columns are integrative, and then you have the neutral, and then you have accommodating. And more than 80% of the observations, 37 out of 48 sub-Saharan African countries, are on the first 2 columns, right? So, and then, Eli brings up a nice paradox, saying, normally when you think of heterogeneous societies, you think of accommodation as the way to bring people together. And so it's kind of telling you that might not be the main preoccupation of African rulers, right? they might be after something else. And I think of course, this illustrates essentially the personal rule nature of politics in Africa, and then its propensity for centralization of power, right? So that compounds the problem. So the way the exercise here looks at dealing with conflict resolution, assume some sort of benevolence from rulers who want to actually deal with this. But of course, there's a lot of literature suggesting that conflict might not be so bad for incumbents. They can be instrumentalized, or they might not be their first preoccupation. Right? So I think that your findings come to this in an interesting way, really providing strong empirical evidence for this centralizing nature of power. Now, I don't think that means that that African states are not accommodating at all. It's a function of what you look at, right? So here you look at the nature of power, the way it's exercised. But there are other dimensions through which states are accommodating. And we were talking about a little bit last night at dinner about some of that. African states are very plural in many ways. So if you think of the post-colonial African state, with a few exceptions, they're really available to everybody. Like they're defined in very neutral post-colonial terms. For example, we have the Central African Republic, right? You cannot be more neutral as a way to name a state than that, right? So we're not talking about Kazakhstan, right? The state of somebody, right? Or Turkey or France, right? This is a state that's neutrally defined, and therefore anybody who's part of it can make a plausible claim to take power there, right? And so look, in Kenya, for example, it's not that that not everybody can share. The question is, we cannot really share at the same time, right? So to take Michel Arong's expression, right, whose time is it to eat? Well, the Kalenjins have eaten, the Kikuyus can eat, possibly the Luos can eat, right? But it's hard to eat at the same time, that's for sure. But the state is defined in such a manner in Africa, in general, so that it's available. It is accommodating over time, if you will, right, for different groups. But the nature of what's at stake, power, the authority of state control, the privileges that come from controlling the state, those are not very fungible. So they don't lend themselves very well to constitutions whereby the fruit would be shared at the same time period. Right? So if you look at it over time, you can think of the African state as an accommodating state, with a few exceptions, right? And interestingly, some of these exceptions end up in the other two columns as accommodating. When you look at what countries end up there, you find that you have Botswana and Lesotho, which would be two non-conventional African states. They have actually ethnic names in them, right? The state of Botswana, the state of Lesotho. Those are very, idiosyncratic colonial creation as British protectorates to prevent these groups from encroachment by the Boers in South Africa. And then you have Cape Verde, Sao Tome, Mauritius, three tiny islands which were essentially populated through colonization, but they don't have really a strong pre-colonial legacy of different claims to power, right? Then you have Somalia, which I'm not going to engage with. But essentially, Somalia really is an unusual state by virtue of being truly the state of the Somali, right? And it's different from the rest of Africa. So there's something there. You think of this constitution in terms of being the explanatory variable of some conflict outcome, but you can also endogenize these variables, say, wow, who ends up where and why, and what can we learn about that? And so you contextualize this constitution making in the broader perspective of the history and the politics of the country. So I think it's remarkably rich, and is this your dissertation work? Or?
Not yet.
But you're on the right track, yeah, this is promising. One of the best part of the paper, I thought, was the distinction between de facto and de jure. My first intuition when I started reading, like, oh my gosh, I'm not a lawyer and I don't have a lot of faith in constitutions per se in Africa. I work on Congo, so that might be where my bias comes from. But then I realized, yes, he's doing it. He's actually distinguishing between the text and the implementation of the text. And then you find that, countries shift considerably. And that's very insightful. And I think that one could actually study what is the difference, right? When you are not de facto where you are de jure, why is that? What do these countries have that's different? What is that a function of? And I think we could learn a lot from that also. Now, I looked at the DRC, and sure enough, the DRC is 2 spots below de facto where it should be de jure, right? So you see countries that come up with constitutions in a post-conflict setting, and the constitution is heavily promoted by outsiders, and by donors, and then they design mechanism whereby they think they will address the accommodation dimension. And in the case of Congo, of course, the big thing was to go to federalism or not, and there's strong resistance to federalism, and so they came up with this formula. They call it a highly decentralized unitary state, right? Which has something very Belgian to it also. But then progressively, right? So that there's accommodation there that included decentralization, creating 25 provinces, whereas there used to be only 11. There's a guarantee in the Constitution that the provinces can retain 40% of their tax benefit at the source before transferring the rest to the central government. None of these things were implemented. The government did not go, it kept the 11 provinces that are now. It did not transfer, the 40% never took place. And in fact, at the beginning of this year, they had a constitutional reform whereby they moved from a two-round presidential election to a one-round presidential election and put on the back burner forever the idea of 25 provinces. So you see here an adjustment of the de jure to the de facto. It's a process of reappropriation by the Congolese, but it goes against the accommodating wishes of the post-conflict helpers, if you will, right? So you can think of it as a pessimistic thing or not, I don't know. And I want to echo Zachary's issue about duration. I think it would be very interesting to find out, and you mentioned it in the appendix when you look case by case, right? But when you go into a broader, I assume, broader quantitative treatment of this, to put a variable for the length of time that the Constitution has been in place, it's like a sample size. The longer it's been there, then the more valuable information it provides you about how effective it might be, right? So I would either put some sort of interaction terms or find a way to control for that. But I think it's very interesting. It's a very interesting step in methodology and scholarship, so I congratulate you for that, and I'm looking forward to the rest of your work. Switching to Nigeria, I agree that Egosa's paper is remarkably dense and informative. So if you don't know much about the region, both the Delta and the country as a whole, this is a wonderful shortcut to get to know about the complex politics of Nigeria. And Egosa really follows the shock methodology, right? He identifies three shocks. First, the coming of oil into the Nigerian political economy, and then looking at the Delta, the deterioration of the environment, and then how the oil price shock of the last 10 or so years have changed things. Now, in short, I think that we can say that oil undermines federalism in Nigeria. Oil essentially is a poison to the practice of federalism, and at the same time, oil increased the demand for federalism in Nigeria. So let me briefly go over these 2 points. Egosa used the expression the hyper-centralized federal system, which reminds you of the highly decentralized unitary state, right? So Nigeria is a hyper-centralized federal system. And where does that come from? It's because all things associated with oil, which is the engine of the Nigerian political economy, are actually centralized, not federalized. So land is owned by the federal state, right? It's true of many countries, but it's very important in Nigeria, where that means access to oil. And then the revenue allocation from oil goes to some sort of central fund to be then redistributed. But it's a centralized process of appropriation and then redistribution. It's not the federal logic, right? And then, of course, the oil companies are all actually state companies. When you hear of Shell Nigeria, this is actually a majority-owned state company by Nigeria. So they're the ones doing the messing up in their own regions there. So that leads to a lack of local ownership, if you will, lack of local institutional accountability to the local communities, which defeats the idea of federalism, right? So when there are local grievances in the Delta, for example, they are dealt with in a very top-down way through allocations of resource by the central government with special formulas giving extra money to certain regions, and those that are given to the states or the local government authority, which is like a sub-state unit. But as Egosa makes very clear, these are not necessarily coterminous with the communities that are the victims and who makes the grievance, right? So essentially, you have a redistribution to local elites who might not necessarily be interested in fixing the problem. And then to switch to the other side, it leads to an increase in demand for federalism, because how do you get access to the state? How do you eat in Nigeria? It's by having access to statehood, to any kind of dimensions of statehood, and therefore being able to make a claim on the redistribution of oil revenues. Now, at the national level, that's decided on the basis of the federal principle, the federal character, that we will balance things, right, among the different 6 sub-regions, if you will. But this has been kind of remultiplied at a local level, where the federal principle has led to the question of, well, you know, within each state, who gets access to the benefits of statehood and the revenues from oil? Well, we have to balance between people of the state. Who's from the state? Who's an indigenous of the state? What ethnic group are you from? Is this ethnic group from this state? And if the incumbents manage to squeeze you out as an autochthonous, as somebody who's not from the state, then what's left for you? Make your own state, right? So then you have an endless list of demands for statehood, which leads to an unstable federal equilibrium, if you will, where there's always increased demand for statehood to have access by minorities, and therefore you get to the production of micro-identities. From the old 3 big regions of the 1960s, now you have 36 states with a multitude of smaller identities who clamor for statehood in order to have access to the benefits of federalism. So it's a very vicious system in terms of creating potential conflict identities and polarizing the state and the community at a local level. Philip, I'm so sorry we're all doing this to you. You were so good with timing, and then we all end up with like a minute for you. So, you know, if we were in Antwerp, if you were here, we could go for a beer after this, and it would be, we'll do some time later, but let me say, no, and then the 1 minute that I have, I wasted on stupidity. Can I just get the 2 minutes back, please? All right, so I think that Burundi, I agree with you, is a fascinating experiment in consociationalism, right? Especially coming from an ethnic amnesia model that Rwanda is doing now. So it's a great exercise. So what you're saying is this, that in 1993 it didn't work out. In 2005 it worked out very well. And essentially, say 93, the push for democratization that came also from the donors forced Buyoya to rush things, whereas the Tutsis were not really ready to be a minority. They were just ready to accommodate the Hutus and to acknowledge that they may have a room at the table, but not to surrender everything to them. And therefore, you know, the Hutu president who won the election, Ndadaye, in 93, got killed by Tutsi, probably Tutsi leadership in the army, and then we had 15 years of civil war. Now, why did things turn successful in 2005? You said there's the presence of international force, and South Africa played a big role there. The mediation of Mandela, and the fact that the Tutsi are pretty much accepted by then, you know, psychologically to surrender complete control. I think you're too optimistic. I think that the contrast with Rwanda may make you feel too good about the success of Burundi, although you do acknowledge the shortcomings. But Stefan van den Gins, who I think is in your own center, has written on how this whole consociational system has or has not worked in Burundi since 2005. So after the successful elections of 2005, there was complete paralysis. So parliament, which gives a minority veto to the Tutsi, if you will, has essentially not passed any meaningful legislation. Government has not been able to do much. So there's a trade-off between accommodating groups and governing and making policy, which is about choices, right? So I think that Burundi shows us the limitations of accommodation. And then you have the 2010 elections, where after the communal elections, the opposition decides that it's not free and fair, and they boycott. So when you have a boycott election, that is not necessarily a successful system, even though that might have been the goal of the opponents, of course. And then you end up with 80% in power. And so that, again, that defeats consociationalism if you end up with an 80% majority. And so all these quotas and these minority protections are essentially evaded in practice. Now, I agree with you that it's wonderful how the country moved away. It shows that the critique of consociationalism that says you will reinforce ethnic identity is not true. In Burundi, the most incredible thing that has happened since 2005 is the fact that the Tutsis have become less and less politically significant. But at the same time, you have new divisions, right? You said they're among parties, they're among different factions of Hutus. And to some extent, I'm not sure that's a huge improvement because it proves that people will fight over control of the state, and these alliances might shift in terms of identity or in terms of personnel, but essentially there's just not enough for everybody to go around, right? The economic returns of controlling the state are so big compared to any other option in the country that it will continue to be such an appealing goal that people will factionalize and fight over it. And so you can engineer rules that move the fight away from certain dimensions to others, but I think that Burundian politics seem to remain a polarized type of politics. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, wonderful. You know, we tried to get Pierre at the first organizational meeting in Washington, D.C., and he couldn't make it. And then we tried to get him in Antwerp, and he said yes, but then he had a conflict and he had to cancel, and so we managed to get him here. And all I can say is you were worth the wait.
I'm so glad I was able to come here. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm sure that our paper presenters would like to respond, but I'm not going to let them. I would like to turn the floor now over to any questions in the audience. And we have a microphone, and we have a runner with the microphone. So please, if you could raise your hands, and then let's, oh, now what do I do? My mentor or my ambassador? This is tough. Well, you are the keynote speaker, so I will go with keynote speaker first. First, we'll go with the ambassador. If you could just, well, I'll identify you. This is Alan Gulti, former UK ambassador to Sudan, Tunisia, elsewhere.
A very simple practitioner's question for Ellie. What, if any, correlation do you find between your codings of African countries for constitutional design and their ratings for performance in the Mo Ibrahim Governance Index?
Yes, that's something I haven't, it's been suggested to me to look into that actually, and it's something that I haven't looked at yet. I haven't done any real quantitative analysis yet. I'm kind of waiting to move it into a panel data set where we'll have, changes over time before looking for those correlations, but that's definitely something to look at.
To Philippe,
This is Bill Zartman from Johns Hopkins University.
To Philippe, one thing that comes out very strongly in your paper is the enormous influence of the international community in setting things presumably aright. How do you explain that? Later on in your paper, after pointing that out, you say the cost of crisis, but there are lots of places where the cost of crisis is at least as big or maybe bigger, and the international community seems to be powerless or uninterested.
Philippe?
Can you answer that now?
Yes, please.
Yes, please. Okay. I'm not going to address points made by Zachary and Pierre. I think they're absolutely valuable, and I would very much, if I may, on one point which was raised by Zachary, what is important, of course, is the modality of the transition. I mean, if you compare what happened in Burundi with what happened in Rwanda around the same period, as you rightly pointed out. Well, in Rwanda, you had a unilateral military takeover by the RPF, while in Burundi, this was a negotiated process. And actually, in terms of reality of power, a Burundian solution would be impossible for Rwanda. I mean, it would be totally unacceptable for the ruling RPF. Let me address Bill's point. Yeah, I think it's crucial. I don't think that without these pretty voluntarist, pretty strong actually steps taken by the international, I would say in particular the regional community in Burundi, it would probably not have worked. And maybe the two things have been essential. I mean, the regional leaders have consistently resisted all attempts by several parties, particularly Tutsi parties, to stall the process. And they've Mandela, for instance, and then later, of course, Zuma, but particularly Mandela, showed a great deal of impatience with the Burundian parties, and he lectured them in no uncertain terms. And then, of course, as I said, I mean, without the deployment of an international, first AU, later UN peacekeeping force with a very strong, incredible South African contingent, the army might, again, as in the past, not have stood aloof of what happens politically speaking. So I think it's, of course, always difficult to say what among the factors that I've outlined, apart from constitutional design, have played such a major role in making this work against all odds, basically. I mean, this was something many people were extremely pessimistic about, and it could have, that's what I say in the conclusion, it could have failed. To some extent, luck is also a factor that plays, and it's a combination of factors that make you lucky or unlucky, you know. But it might have failed, just like it has failed in other countries. I don't know whether that's an answer to your point, Bill.
That's great. Thank you, Philippe. Other questions? Oh. This is another one of our panelists later today, Mohammed Saleh.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would like to thank the presenters, but also for the discussants for very excellent contributions that they have made. I have two very, very short questions. One to Ele. I think you have done a marvelous job. And in fact, one of my comments is that where you're writing a book, but it became very clear now that you are writing your PhD, and we are all looking forward to reading it. Have you tried some analysis of local government, for instance, and to see to what extent the transfer and the relationship between local and central government, particularly the way how constitution look at that? If you do this, of course, you will be also first, not only in having the fairest index, but also the second one as well. My question to Philip. Hi, Philip. Okay. You can hear me, okay. My question to you, of course, about constitutionalism, and I think you came as one of the discussants said here, with a very optimistic view. One of the downsides of constitutionalism is that, in fact, it leads to the entrenchment of elite interests, but also ethnicity itself. Of course, the intention is to neutralize ethnicity and to reach political accommodation through a non-majoritarian means. Of course, that is very good in the short run, but in the long run, it entrenches that. Of course, you mentioned yourself the case of Cyprus and the case of Lebanon, and also it showed that it is synthetic in a sense that this peaceful accommodation that you have is short-lived. I would like to see your view on whether, even with the current alignment of elite from different ethnic groups joining one political party, whether it's really synthetic and short-term, or is it something that is going to be sustained? Thank you.
Let's, Philippe, can you want to start first?
Yeah, all right. As I mentioned in the conclusion of the paper, there are, how should I say, there are a number of deficits, including obviously democratic deficits, but also efficiency deficits included or involved in consociational setup. Let me again say that Burundi is by no means a perfect example of a consociational setup. A number of elements that we associated with consociationalism are definitely not present in Burundi. For instance, there are no Hutu and Tutsi schools, for instance. I mean, you could in a country like, where the languages are different, for instance, Cyprus was mentioned as an example, Belgium would be another perhaps failing example of a consociational setup. We still have no government, you know, after 1.5 years almost after the last general elections. So what I'm saying in the conclusion is that this is probably a system that would be useful during a certain period of time when it is necessary. I mean, in the context of Burundi, it was consociationalism or continued civil war, basically. And you could see, I mean, I mentioned the first very prudent attempts at something that went towards consociationalism already in 1988 without even the terms Hutu and Tutsi being mentioned in the constitution or in the work of the National Commission to study the problem of national unity. So it may well be that, by the way, when you talk about elite interests that are being entrenched, I think politics in general, certainly politics in Africa, are very much elite politics anyway. Elite interests are generally entrenched, whether you do it through consociational setup or otherwise. But I agree, apart from that, I think the moment will probably come when the Burundians feel secure enough about their quote-unquote ethnic relations that they can do away with these things. I mean, in theory, the thing is very simple. Respect human rights and implement a truly democratic system. And obviously you don't need consociational systems protecting minorities, for instance.
Decentralization plans. What I did find is that a lot of decentralization policies are not being actually implemented in the way that they're written. But I agree there needs to be more research on that specific issue.
If there are no more hands, then what we'll do, oh, we have one. Let's take one final question. Can you identify yourself, please?
Yeah, I'm Peter Beck from St. Edward's University here in Austin. And I've got I'd like to throw climate change into the mix for anybody to comment on. But in your visual model, constitutional design has a big box, and the other ones are small. And I'm thinking about some of the impacts of climate change and wondering whether, manipulating constitutional design features will be able to deal with them. Among them, the fact that inevitably it's going to, or in most cases, it's likely to reduce the size of the pie. So if people are fighting in Nigeria over increased amount of resources through oil, this is just going to further exacerbate the conflicts. And the other aspect is that within countries, regionally, but also within countries, the impacts are likely to vary tremendously. And in Africa, where we have different ethnic groups inhabiting different regions, generally, that means different ethnic groups are going to be impacted in different ways. And are these combining factors maybe going to overwhelm whatever the constitutional design features are?
Igosa, are you on the line?
Yes, I am. You can hear me.
Maybe let me direct the question to you, because you have the different identity groups. You have the contestation over distribution of resources. How about if we throw on top of this climate change going down the road? If there's going to be flooding, if there's going to be drought, how do you think this is going to affect outcomes? And do you think constitutional design will have anything to do with it? Or do you think that these will be such overwhelming shocks that they will overcome any attempts at management through constitutional design, as Zach Elkins talked about?
First, do you hear me clearly?
Yes.
The thing to say is to make a very important remark, which is also in the paper that I have presented.
Okay, one second. Can you hold on? We have to identify where the echo is coming from.
Can you hear me now?
Philippe, can you turn off your microphone, Philippe? We'll see if that's the problem.
You want me to turn it off?
Turn off your microphone.
Okay.
Okay, let's try again. Igosa?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Better now? Now, I was saying the first thing that I find very remarkable is that, in the distribution of legislative power in the Nigerian constitution, there is no mention whatsoever of the environment, which must mean, that that's probably a residual matter that would have to be resolved constitutionally, one way or the other. Now, but that in terms of the constitutional design, there is really no framework thought. You can say has capacity to deal with those kinds of issues, other than the kinds of social, economic, and political demands that would come from such climate change kinds of things in Niger Delta. Now, so as far as it's difficult, for constitutions to anticipate what climate change can lead to in the immediate future, or very distant. The point is that these are experiential things, and many of them we have seen in analysis are not things that can be controlled.
Igosa?
Or even sufficiently engineered.
Igosa, I think we're having audio difficulties, so I appreciate your efforts, but I think we're going to have to end the panel.